And with that, I would love to welcome you all to this session of our webinar series, our ongoing webinar series on Forest Health Research Program grantee research. Today, we are being joined by Sumi Hoshiko from the California Department of Public Health and Dr. Anna Rappold from the US EPA. And they are going to be presenting part 2 of their Public Health Impacts of Prescribed Fire study. This presentation is on community impacts of prescribed fire, findings from WUI communities from listening sessions, and a survey of medically vulnerable adults. Before we get started, I do have a little bit of housekeeping. So just to let you know, once again, this meeting is being recorded, and that recording of the presentation is going to be posted on our website along with slides from the presentation. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, and we will have plenty of time to get to as many of your questions as possible. If you do have questions at any point throughout the presentation, you can feel free to enter them in the chat or use the raise hand feature, and I'll be moderating those questions at the end to make sure that they make it to our presenters, and we'll get those answered as well as we can. With that, I also just want to mention that this is part of our Forest Health Research Program, which, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, is one of the programs within the Fire and Resource Assessment Program at CAL FIRE, and we have the mission of funding research that is critical to the forest and vegetation management throughout the state and fire management throughout the state, and the many efforts that various agencies are undertaking in that field. For more information on the program, please do visit our website that's listed on the slide here. I wanted to note that our recent solicitation for concept proposals for the Forest Health Research Grant Program is now closed. And for anyone who has submitted concept proposals, we'll be notifying invited applicants in a couple of weeks, well, a little bit more than 1 week, as to whether you're invited for a full proposal, and we'll be making announcements about the funded proposals later this summer. So please be on the lookout for those as well. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers. Sumi Hoshiko is a research scientist with the California Department of Public Health, where she leads the recently formed Climate Change and Health Unit within the Environmental Health Investigations Branch. She is the principal investigator for a study funded by CAL FIRE examining the public health impacts of increasing prescribed fire smoke. This study continues earlier research on the health effects of wildfire smoke. Previous investigations include heat-related mortality and a variety of environmental exposures and health conditions, including tobacco smoke, chromium, perchlorate, radiation, cancer clusters, and asthma. She holds a Master of Public Health in Epidemiology and Biostatistics from UC Berkeley. And Dr. Anna Rappold is a statistician and clinical research branch chief at the US EPA. Anna conducts clinical and epidemiological research on health effects from air pollution and other environmental exposures, and has authored several studies specific to wildfire smoke impacts on cardiopulmonary health. Anna received a 2019 Arthur S. Fleming Award for the Smoke Sense Project, a smartphone citizen science app that seeks to answer how people experience wildfire smoke and builds community around health protective behaviors in the face of exposures. Thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this important research with us and with all the other attendees here. And with that, I will turn it over to Sumi to kick off the presentation.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So thank you, Max, for the introduction. So I know Dr. Rappold and I are really excited to be here today and have a chance to share what we've learned from our research, really focused in the wildland-urban interface communities. And I think this webinar is particularly important because I believe community members would be really happy to know that their input was reaching people who are in agencies and roles for whom this information would be most relevant. They really wanted to feel their participation in research would help make a difference. So we just appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And we're really interested in hearing your thoughts and reactions to what we heard from community members. And as Max stated, the overall aim of our research study was to examine this question of what is the public health impact of increasing prescribed fire on air quality and public health. Today, we're focusing on the part of the research that looks at community impacts specifically. And as you know, this research is funded by a grant from CAL FIRE. And I just wanted to reiterate that we're really appreciative of that. And to acknowledge that this research is a collaborative effort of many people and organizations. Next slide, please. So just a disclaimer that this is not official policy of any agency. Next slide. And I'll just start with some background. Next slide. So I imagine that everyone on this call is well aware of the wildfire situation that we're confronting in California. And of course, in the last few years, it's become apparent that the threat is not just from the fires themselves, but the impact of smoke on population health that's really impacted people located even very far away from the original fire source. Next slide, please. Yeah, we also know that California is taking really substantial actions to reduce these risks. And in that context, prescribed fire is a really key mitigation tool. And as we know, the value it extends beyond just prevention of catastrophic wildfires, but to other ecological and other benefits as well. Next slide, please. So our overarching goal in this study was to address this question, like, what is this policy of increased prescribed fire? How is that going to impact air quality and public health? Next slide. So to give an overall picture of the research before we go into our specific topic today, the first component was a really extensive smoke and exposure analysis conducted by the experts at Sonoma Technology. And that's a calculation of the future prescribed fire smoke concentrations across California under a model that projected those increases. And we also were estimating past wildfire and prescribed fire smoke concentrations. And then in the second part, the health component, we used that smoke output data to calculate the health burden for these past and future scenarios. Next slide, please. And then today we're focusing on part 3, the community engagement. So we decided to incorporate community engagement because we wanted a fuller understanding of what people actually experience with wildfire and prescribed fire and how it affects them. Next slide. So our goal was to deepen our understanding of what these vulnerable communities, particularly in the wildland-urban interface, are experiencing. And most of us in epidemiology, our studies, when we're trying to understand the health impacts of wildfire smoke, we rely on administrative health data. We look at hospitalization data, emergency department rates, are they going up or down? But we know these outcomes are only the tip of the iceberg. So we wanted to go directly to community members and hear from them and get a fuller understanding of what the impact is on their lives. Also, previous research exists that studied, surveyed attitudes about prescribed fire. And, it's been known there's general public acceptance for prescribed fire, but we've also felt that, but a lot of those studies were done like 2016 and earlier. And we were wondering if the more recent wildfire experience, especially in California and the West, might have influenced public opinion. So we also wanted to get a more current understanding of attitudes, especially in these areas that are like very impacted. And also, very few past studies have investigated the health impact of prescribed fire smoke, more focused on wildfire, of course. So we did this through 2 activities, one being listening sessions and the other a community survey. And so we were aiming to understand people's experiences with wildfire and prescribed fire smoke. What did they perceive to be the impact on their health and their life and quality of life? What were they doing to reduce their exposure or protect their health? What were the challenges they were facing in trying to do that? Or what do they know about prescribed fire? How are they getting their information? What do they feel like they need to know? And as I mentioned, what are their attitudes about prescribed fire? So all of this was really in service to understanding how can we improve community preparedness and resilience. Next slide, please. So we conducted our listening sessions virtually in Nevada and El Dorado counties. And a full report and summary brief are available on our webpage. Next slide, please. And the listening sessions took place at the end of 2020 in El Dorado and Nevada counties. We had a total of 32 participants. Next slide, please. Just to look at some demographics as background, we see that El Dorado and Nevada counties are much more rural than California overall, and the population is mainly non-Hispanic white. Next slide, please. So we used a local organization based in Nevada County to conduct our outreach. And we knew this organization had deep knowledge and connections in the community. Subjects were recruited from different supervisorial districts, and the districts themselves had varying levels of income and other characteristics, such as whether they were more rural or they were a town. We had screening questions because we wanted to ensure we weren't just getting the same demographic profile of all the participants, but we didn't have strict quotas. We also, in doing this, encountered some community members who we felt we would expect to have greater knowledge about prescribed fire and wildfires, but we didn't want to exclude them as we wanted to capture their valuable input. So we just assigned them to a separate group that we called influencers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we did this in 2020, so it was the first year of COVID, and we held these virtually. Participants could provide input in several ways. They could speak. We had live polls, and there was chat. All the audio was recorded and transcribed and reviewed. We started the session in a main room, and then we had breakout rooms of 2 to 5 people with a moderator who took whiteboard notes. Next slide, please. So we covered a lot of content areas. But in addition to these, we were also open to identifying emerging themes, topics that we hadn't posed to them specifically. Next slide, please. Now to move to our findings. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's right. So there was complete 100% support for prescribed fire as a means to reduce the risk of large wildfires. So admittedly, this is a small sample, but it was nevertheless relevant that we saw some indication of slightly diminished support for the policy of increased prescribed fire. And about a quarter of the participants also expressed concern about prescribed fire getting out of control, or they had some other reservations. Next slide, please. So residents in these areas were well familiar with wildfires. A majority were aware of at least one prescribed fire. And a majority also reported their health had been negatively impacted by smoke. And we didn't try in this setting to just have them distinguish between wildfire and prescribed fire smoke. So this format was really able to capture these qualitative descriptions of health impacts that would not be represented in our typical epidemiologic studies of hospital data. For example, I think this one participant's comments represents an important point. They say, I have asthma. As long as the air quality is good, I don't have to take my inhaler. When there are forest fires or prescribed fires, I have to use my inhaler quite a bit. However, all that being said, it's very important for us, in my opinion, to do this. I agree it needs to be done for the safety of many, but it really affects my health. So here's a person whose health is clearly impacted by smoke, but still supports prescribed fire. So both of these things can be true at the same time. It underscores that the point that support for the policy doesn't necessarily mean that people are not having any health impacts. And similarly with the person whose oxygen levels decrease when there's smoke exposure. And we also learned that people in these areas really have some trauma because of their experience with wildfires, where they become immediately concerned if they see a burn or if they smell smoke. They feel like there's a lot of stress. They need to quickly find out, is it a wildfire? Do they need to take action? Or is it a prescribed fire? But it's also important to note that not everyone was experiencing health symptoms. Some people are more sensitive than others. And of course, it depends on how much exposure a person has. Next slide, please. So we wanted to know what issues people were encountering and trying to protect their health. So we heard a lot about the trouble people were having in actually just trying to buy the equipment like air filters during the wildfires. But there was also confusion about what to buy. So, in public health, we commonly recommend using the air conditioning system and upgrading filters, but many people don't have air conditioning actually. Next slide, please. So I think it's understandable about the confusion about portable air filters. They range in price from, well under $100 to thousands of dollars. And as one person stated, they didn't know what was effective or worth it. Another participant said that they were using Wirecutter, which is a product review guide that put out by the New York Times, and they were recommending it to others in the group. And I think this comment by another participant, we're staying in. We had all the doors shut, and we try as best as we can to use our filters. We don't have HEPA filters in the house, but we did try to keep the circulating fan on for the interior to try and keep it going a little bit through the filters. So I think their comment illustrates how people's lives are impacted, how they're attempting to deal with the situation. It just suggests to me that people are doing the best they can with what they have. Next slide, please. So we solicited suggestions, asked people to identify what could be helpful. Oh, okay, I have to okay, turn on the light here. Sorry. So they supported more education about prescribed fire, as well as more education about air quality requirements. There was interest in this group for residents, for burn classes for residents who either wanted to learn more about it or actually learn how to conduct burns themselves. It was even mentioned that there was interest in firefighting training, like community level. Someone suggested they would like a class that would provide information about what they should do if they encountered a fire just starting, like on the side of the road. But I'm going to leave that comment and idea to the professionals. Next slide. People wanted to learn about prescribed burns, and as one participant stated, just more information about what exactly is a prescribed burn and how it's done, because I don't know those details, and I don't think a lot of the public does. So that would alleviate some concerns. So I think this illustrates the importance that education can have in helping people gain a greater understanding and therefore acceptance for prescribed fire. The second quote, just like having the fire department have a fun education event, and they could do like a demo burn pile just to make it like something with ice cream and, make it so it feels communal and fun and educational. So people in this listening session thought this approach would be effective, that it would be good to have a partnership or shared event with the local fire department and the community. There was a sentiment that making it a community-centered festival would go over well. There was some discussion about resistance to government mandates. The whole mask issue and the controversy around this was very prevalent at that time. Next slide, please. We asked the group for suggestions that they had. Their concerns about prescribed fire focused a lot on safety and proper planning. It was also mentioned that if they see a prescribed fire but they don't see personnel monitoring it, they could be concerned and they would want to see that. Residents in these areas typically they have a lot of vegetation on their own property and need to get rid of it, and would like more support for alternate ways of doing that, so that would reduce the need for them to burn. And then again, with managed fire, they're supportive, but with caveats about safety and control. Next slide, please. So participants wanted more details about prescribed fire. There was discussion about how there's uncertainty until very close to the date itself about whether the burn would go forward or not. But given that uncertainty, people felt like they would rather be notified like at least a week ahead of time, even if it wasn't for sure, and then be informed about the reasons why it would or wouldn't occur. Meaning, don't wait to tell us until it's certain, just let us know ahead of time. They also wanted information about who to contact, as well as what the expected air quality would be and during what hours. Additional information they wanted was details like the size of the burn, the reasons for it. The method of notification was also important. People wanted some way of ensuring they received notification, like could there be automatic text notifications or even robocalls? So this quote illustrates what can happen in these areas. People can jump to the conclusion there's a wildfire if they aren't notified, and we know that that can cause stress. Next slide, please. There was a fair amount of discussion also about among themselves, like how could they notify neighbors if they are burning? Ideas were suggested, like could there be an online map where you could drop a pin to indicate you were burning? People also described some frustration or confusion about when they were trying to find out about whether there was a wildfire or a prescribed fire. In these areas, they typically rely on social media, but they wanted a more authoritative source so they could feel confident they were actually getting the right information. And then when asked about how education should be done, they thought that, rather than creating some new structure to convey information about prescribed fire, that existing methods could be used, like building on channels that are already in place, like Firewise USA. Various options that did not rely on the internet were also cited as important. Could residents call 211, for example, to get information? In addition to traditional communications like flyers or TV or PSAs. In these areas, people often have internet subscriptions, but it's just unreliable. So that's just like a barrier they deal with. Next slide, please. Residents described having to search a variety of sources in order to get information. And this came up even in the influencers group. Next slide, please. So several themes emerged. One was about equity, and I think this is exemplified in the quote. People need to be educated and they need resources. They need to have access to resources if they don't have other means to protect their health during major smoke events. Another topic that came up was the importance of indigenous practices and cultural burning, and can we learn from that cultural knowledge. And then in terms of education, the suggestion was made that for newcomers to the area, such as new homeowners, they could be provided with a packet of information when they moved to the area. It was also suggested it would be helpful if tourists were educated about prescribed fire. And one resident gave the example that they were concerned about a new neighbor who was burning on their own property nearby, but apparently didn't know how to go about it correctly. Next slide, please. So moving on to our other community engagement activity. This was a survey in Mariposa County. Next slide, please. So for this survey, CDPH conducted this in collaboration with Mariposa County Health and Human Services Agency. The survey was focused on a medically vulnerable adult population in this high fire risk area in the Sierra Nevada mountain foothills. Participants were in a program run by the county, which assists persons who self-identify as having special needs in an emergency. The survey was mailed, there was a phone interview option, and participants could receive a $25 gift card from a local pharmacy or grocery for their participation. So we're seeking the same type of information as the listening sessions. And again, the survey covered a wide range of topics. Next slide. And then next slide. As expected, this population was clearly what would be considered among the most vulnerable. Most were 65 years or older, and a large proportion were actually over the age of 80. Many were long-term residents who had lived in the county for over 20 years, and a majority also had 2 or more chronic health conditions, the most commonly being hypertension. Next slide, please. Similar to the listening sessions, the majority supported prescribed fire for the purpose of preventing large wildfires, and to a slightly lesser extent for ecological purposes. Again, there was a slight diminishing support for the policy of increasing prescribed fire. And similarly, there was a not insignificant proportion of respondents who had some questions or needed more information before supporting increased prescribed fire. And interestingly, the longer-term residents of the county were less likely to support increased prescribed fire. And the quote, I worry about control with these fires. Why it is sometimes done on a windy day and gets out of control. So I think this underscores the importance of providing information and education to the community about the how and why. And as we saw in the listening sessions, people felt that more knowledge could help people feel more comfortable with prescribed fire. Next slide, please. The majority of participants were familiar with both wildfire and prescribed fire. We didn't really know what to expect with regard to whether people would be able to identify health effects from prescribed fire smoke specifically. But we found that over half reported health effects from wildfire smoke, and about a quarter from health effects from prescribed fire smoke even. Over a third of respondents reported seeking care for smoke-related health symptoms. So similar to what we saw in the listening sessions, This suggests that many people may be experiencing symptoms but not seeking care. So on the one hand, this might reflect that the symptoms were not severe enough to warrant a medical visit. It does show that there's an impact on people's health and lives that's not being captured in the usual studies that rely on medical system encounters. Next slide, please. So in this population, almost everyone reported needing to take some action to protect their health from smoke. It was interesting that over half also reported taking action because of prescribed fire smoke. One notable takeaway was that persons who reported feeling satisfied with the information they were receiving about prescribed fire were also more likely to feel confident in their ability to protect their health. So again, this underscores the value in providing education and notifications about prescribed fire. Unfortunately, it also appeared that although some people reported having some knowledge of how to protect themselves from smoke, they still did not feel they were completely confident that they could protect their health. Next slide, please. These are some of the comments that we gathered that I think illuminate this population's vulnerability. Note that one comment where the person mentions that they're on oxygen, they need a place to go during episodes of prescribed fire, and they need transportation to get there. This population depends very heavily on caregivers, whether it's family members or in some cases other caregivers. Next slide, please. We listed a lot of topics and let people check if they wanted information on them. So every topic we suggested was of interest. Of most interest was notification in advance, 1 week of a prescribed fire. People wanted to know specifically when smoke would be present and the details about the burn. In addition to wanting information about prescribed fire, another topic of strong interest was information on health effects for persons with medical conditions. People also asked for practical information like how to make a clean air room or a DIY filter, where to find a clean air shelter, how to use the AQI. We asked where they were currently getting their news from and where they would like to receive news from in the future. Well, TV and newspapers were the most common sources in the past. Government sources were the most requested for the future, and this was true across all the agency types that we listed as possible sources. Although it was only a minority of respondents who reported having used social media, there was increasing interest to obtain information from Twitter and online forums in the future. And there was interest in receiving information from prescribed burn associations. 19% of respondents indicated dissatisfaction with the information they currently receive about prescribed fire. So although this is a minority, I think this illustrates an information gap that's important to address. And there was clear support for Mariposa County Public Health in that respondents showed the strongest desire for information from their local health agency in the future. So other areas that residents identified they would like help with included help with managing vegetation. There was interest in mechanical fuel reduction methods, more weed clearing around town. Concerns came up around animals, including the need to protect livestock and also challenges in evacuating with them. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I skipped that one. Thank you. So now just to go to some overarching conclusions. Next slide, please. We attempted to consolidate findings from each of these efforts. They had a lot of commonalities, even though the populations were different. Next slide, please. So overall, these areas and people have close familiarity with wildfires. They view prescribed fire as a critical tool to reduce wildfire risks to their communities. However, concerns exist about safety, and people have questions about how prescribed fire is done, how it can be assured to be safe, and they may have some misinformation as well. Next slide, please. While not as surprisingly, the older population in Mariposa reported health impacts from smoke and even prescribed fire smoke. The presence of smoke, whether from wildfire or prescribed fire, was clearly impacting the quality of life and at times significant health conditions, even in the more general population in Nevada and El Dorado counties. We noticed there are mental health aspects of having many consecutive smoky days, as well as the more acute stress of smelling smoke or seeing a fire and being concerned it could be a wildfire. We learned a lot about the obstacles people were facing. Next slide, please. We felt like the qualitative methods were able to provide more detailed information about attitudes and actions, as well as how people were feeling. The need for non-internet dependent sources was consistent for both groups. And among the many highlights we learned was that many people wanted accurate and timely information and to be notified. We had another kind of unanticipated learning that was related to the process overall. So in the listening sessions, as people were in a group, even virtually, we found that despite the challenges that participants were describing, they generated creative and positive suggestions for solutions. And of course, the listening sessions were designed for the benefit of us, the researchers, to get information. We found that the forum, simply bringing people together to have this discussion, it, like serendipitously, was beneficial to the participants. It seemed to create this natural environment where community members were learning from one another about prescribed fire, about community resources, as well as stimulating their interest in learning more. There was this neighborly, cheerful tone that our feeling that developed during the meetings, and these social interactions that sprang up between participants that fostered a sense of community and connections that could extend beyond the meeting itself. So it seemed like the process of bringing people together helped build community resilience. So I don't know, just to conclude, we really hope this information can support and guide efforts to develop interventions and mitigation strategies. Oh, sorry, we're behind here. Thank you. And with the goal of helping communities be more prepared and more resilient. Next slide, please. So these reports are available online, either on CDPH website for the report and or a published journal article. Next slide, please. And then also I just wanted to share, this slide shows the publications from the other parts of the study, some that are published and some that are just submitted. And these cover the exposure modeling and the health analysis of the health burden from wildfire and prescribed fire smoke across California. Next slide, please. So just wanted to thank the community members and acknowledge, that this is really our appreciation for they're taking the time to share their thoughts. Next slide, please. So thank you so much to CAL FIRE and for everyone who attended. And we're really interested in hearing your questions or comments. And they can be for either myself or for Dr. Rappold. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sumi and Anna, for being here to tell us about this this work. It's fantastic to have you present. I will remind the participants that you can please enter questions in the chat for either Sumi or for Anna, and I will go ahead and stop the recording and we'll switch over to our Q&A session. So please go ahead and raise your hands or put your questions in the chat.